Good morning, good afternoon, or good day, ladies and gents, and welcome back to what is effectively going to be our next little segment in our various texts unit for um, English 12. Now, last time we basically did a quick, really quick survey of a little bit of Genesis and then a little bit of the New Testament, just to give you a sample of number one, what sacred literature and biblical literature can look like and feel like when we're reading it, and what's also for number two, what the essential impacts of it were going to be, and or just to get an idea of what some of the impacts of it could be on the rest of English literature in the Western world at the very least. Now, for the next segment of the various text unit, I wanted to take a look at mythic literature. Okay. Now, some people, again, like to distinguish between mythic and sacred literature, even though sacred literature, especially in the Bible, can include mythic texts. That's absolutely fine. There's no huge controversy on that, unless, of course, you want to interpret Genesis literally, as we talked about before. But for this segment, we're actually going to look directly at some very clearly mythic texts. And for the examples that I chose for this particular class, we're going to look at a piece from Hesiod's Theogony and a little segment from Ovid's Metamorphosis. So before we start, depending on whether or not you've been with me for a few classes now, or if you've looked at the humanities class on mythic literature, or ninth grade mythic literature, I like to review really quickly what mythic literature usually entails and what that means essentially. So, what identifies a genre or a piece of work as fitting in the mythic genre? Well, there's a couple different things at first. So, first and foremost, there's usually some presence of a supernatural entity or entities. So there's usually multiple gods, there's demigods, there's like some supernatural force at work in the story. Okay. And typically those mythic beings have a serious like anthropomorphic sort of characteristic about them, in the sense that they have bodies, they have like usually very human emotions and human flaws sometimes, or flaws that are recognizable to us. And then additional to this first feature, we also see that there are fantastical elements, right? There is sometimes direct magic. There is usually an abundance of creatures or beings that are very clearly not literally physically real in our world, like dragons, hydras, sea serpents, nymphs, dryads, all this kind of stuff. So there's fantastical elements as well. And then a final one is typically something that I like to just kind of throw in there as an alternative, or as like an alternative feature that you don't usually hear talked about very often. And that is a setting that is usually linked very closely with a nonfiction setting. So, for instance, of course, if we're reading Greek mythology, you'll very clearly see that ancient Greece is a setting that most of these stories take place in. And the same thing goes to Rome. The same thing goes for Native American, like whatever particular myth you are reading. There's usually a real world setting of some way, shape, or form. So that's some kind of brief overview of the features of the genre. Now, when it comes to the purpose of the genre, and one of the reasons why people look at this particular genre, there's a couple different things. First and foremost, it's interesting to recognize that, of course, mythic literature has been around for several thousand years now, at the very least 3,000 years. The traditions, of course, probably go back much earlier than that. But as far as recorded history goes, we have seen mythology. So, again, like 5,000 years of history, we've been reading these myths, or we've been looking at these myths, I should say. And of course, the Greek myths are no exception to that. We've been really fascinated by and just enthralled by, enchanted by Greek mythology. Well, why? What is it that's so enthralling about them? And typically, I like to teach my students that there's fundamentally just two reasons. And the two reasons that we point out here are really no different than the other two reasons that we would look at any literature or any work of art, any story. Number one, because it's delightful, it is entertaining, it's interesting, right? We just like these stories. There's something about it that we are just drawn to. Okay, I was reading a student's like personal narrative the other day, and the student was basically saying that he likes to, like, from a very young age, he was obsessed with narratives and with stories. And I had no understanding as to why, right? There's a really large and wonderful mystery around why it is that these things draw us so. Now, the other reason for, our fascination and our, almost obsession with stories and myths in general, or the other function, you could say, the purpose of them, is of course that they act as some sort of tool for education to varying degrees, right? There's a serious amount of education that we can glean from these stories. In other words, they teach us things, right? They teach us what? They teach us maybe how to understand the world around us. And they also teach us how to engage with the world around us. So at a senior, more kind of AP level, I like to explain it this way. Human beings have been around for over 10,000 years, right? Very much clearly over 10,000 years. And as a result of that, what have we been doing? We've been self-conscious, and we've also been passing down, both genetically and also just through verbal communication, advice and wisdom of how to enact our lives in this world in a positive way, right? We've been trying to communicate how to live properly and successfully at every level, right? Not just like, getting enough material at every level. So even at a fundamentally religious level, if you want to talk about it that way, at a psychological level, at a social level, at all these other levels, we want to know how to be as successful as possible, as good as possible. And so as a result, what we end up seeing is that everyone, kind of injects their experience or injects their 2 cents into that conversation throughout human history. But what we end up seeing is that the ones that everyone sort of agrees on as like, yes, that's good. Yes, that's good. Yes, that's good. Those ideas, those pieces of advice sort of kind of rise to the top and become the most common and the most popular ones. And the same thing is true for stories. So as we, create these stories about how characters interact with the world and interact with their own problems, our cultures, our civilizations, our species have basically distilled and filtered out the ones that we think are the really, really important ones. And so one of the things that I think myths therefore do for us is they act as Joseph Campbell said, a metaphor for the experience of life, but also, they act as a way that, as some sort of educational tool for us in life. So in other words, we learn something from them about ourselves and about the world and about what we need to do fundamentally, okay? So that's a quick overview of the genre. Now, let's actually look at these two stories. Again, they're really quick, and the two things that I want us to look at are these. Number one, after reading both of them, we need to identify two clear themes that each is communicating. So each one needs to have two themes, okay? The way that I really wanted you to do that is to look at them both and kind of try to synthesize them both and find the two themes that are common to both of them. And then for number two, I want us to identify where in literature, film, or other art forms we have seen similar things that may have been influenced by these works. Okay, so in other words, where else do we see these themes? So let's take a look. Let's break this down. We have the myth of Prometheus. Now, some of us may be familiar with Prometheus. If you saw the recent Oppenheimer movie, there was a quote from the book, The American Prometheus, right? And that's essentially there was a quote about Prometheus, and then the whole movie Oppenheimer was based on a book called The American Prometheus. So there's something about, Oppenheimer and the Prometheus myth. So there's an answer to that last question right away. But let's take a look in more detail as to what this guy, this Titan, this being Prometheus is all about, and also why is he linked with Oppenheimer. So here we go. Oh, and by the way, our author for this one is the Greek author Hesiod, and in the Theogony is a really kind of short but also very, very dense Greek work where he essentially tries to lay out the genealogy of all the different gods and titans and all the beings in between. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, definitely go check out Hesiod. But here's what he writes. High ruling Olympian Zeus approved, for he wished to honor his revered son, and so gave up the anger he held against Prometheus for matching wits with Cronos' mighty son. For when gods and mortals met in Mecone, Prometheus cleverly divided a great ox and set it before him, hoping to deceive Zeus. First, he set down before him flesh and rich fat entrails, and hid them in the ox's stomach. Then he cleverly set down the white ox bones and covered them with shining fat. Then the father of the gods and mortals said to him, "Dear son of Iapetus, noblest of all the gods, you have divided the portions unfairly." So said all-knowing Zeus, mocking him. Okay, so let's take a look here. We have essentially two characters introduced here. We have Zeus, okay, who we recognize as the chief Olympian, right? The king of the gods. And he's got some contention with Prometheus. Who's Prometheus? Prometheus is technically a Titan, he's sort of equated with a god in some sense here, right? They're kind of similar in power, but as we're gonna see, they're definitely not. And Zeus has some anger towards Prometheus because Prometheus has tried to deceive Zeus. And how is he doing this? Well, the image that's given to us is kind of a familiar one to us if we're kind of thinking about ancient world and sacrifices, right? He has this ox, and he tries to divide up the ox at a meal, essentially, unfairly, so that he would give Zeus way less meat than actually is due or would be due, even though the fat, of course, is a very valuable thing, but the bones, not so much. And what do we see here from Prometheus? We see that he is characterized by his cleverness, and he is also attempting to deceive the gods. So there's an element of deceit here. Okay. Now, Zeus, of course, is all-knowing, apparently, in this version of Zeus, so this doesn't work, right? Zeus calls him out and says, you're trying to trick me. But with a smile, crooked counselor Prometheus replied to him, not forgetting his clever trick, "Glorious Zeus, greatest of all immortals, choose whichever one your heart desires." So he said deceptively. All-knowing Zeus spotted the deception, but he desired evil for mortals, which he could fulfill. He took the white fat with both hands, and when he saw the white ox bones and realized the deception, he exploded with rage, his mind filled with malice. Even since then, mortals burn white bones on smoking altars and offering to the gods. And a fuming cloud gatherer told him. And a fuming cloud gatherer Zeus told him. So in other words, yeah, Zeus, again, is not fooled by this. And he is essentially going to, as a result of being tricked and insulted by Prometheus, is going to attack those who Prometheus holds dear. In other words, human beings, right? Prometheus is a little bit, affectionate towards human beings, apparently. And so Zeus is going to try to inflict some sort of evil on them. He says, "So, dear son of Apius, noblest of all the gods, you did not forget your clever tricks after all." So spoke an angry, all-knowing Zeus. And because of this deception, he refused to give the might of eternal fire to the ash trees for mortals who live upon the earth. But the son of Iapetus tricked Zeus again by stealing the far shining gleam of eternal fire in a hollow fennel stalk. It burned deep in high thundering Zeus' soul when he saw the far shining gleam of fire among the mortals. So he devised a wicked punishment for humans. Okay, classic story. We have Zeus withholding fire from mortals, right? He's like, I'm not going to give you, fire and all the symbolic representation of what goes along with that. Fire, like we said, is, linked with life. It's linked very clearly with power and with advancement. It's also linked with danger, therefore. And of course, in a more spiritual sense, it's linked with something of the divine, right? It's the closest element to the divine, I think. And of course, Prometheus, once again, defies Zeus, takes fire in a fennel stalk, brings it down to human beings, and gives it to them. And thus we have an advancement for the human race. Zeus is pissed about this. What does he do? Following the plan of Cronos' son, famed Hephaestus molded from the earth a beautiful girl. Then the gray-eyed goddess Athena dressed her in silvery clothes and covered her head with a finely crafted veil, a true wonder. Around her head, Pallas Athena first placed a garland of fresh flowers of the meadow to arouse desire, and then added a golden diadem made by the hands of the famed lame one Hephaestus to please Zeus, his father. Okay, so Zeus is in retribution, in retaliation of what Prometheus has done to humans. He's having Hephaestus create a woman, right? And he's having Athena kind of, dress her up nice. On this, he added many finely made designs, terrible beasts that had made the seed nourish, made the land and seed nourish. He made many of these, each one a shimmering miracle, as real as living, speaking creature. When he had built this fine but evil creature, the price for fire, he led her out to the other gods and mortals, resplendent in the adornments of Zeus's gray-eyed daughter. Gods and men alike were awed when they saw the steep deception, which men could never control. For she was mother of the race of females who live with men but are their greatest foe, always a friend of luxury, never of poverty. Okay. So talk about, controversial, right? The retribution that Zeus, meets with the human race for, Prometheus's actions here is giving them women, is giving them the females essentially. And as he describes them here, they are their greatest foe, always a friend of luxury, never of poverty, right? Always kind of seeping material means away from men. Okay, so we'll address that in a minute, but let's just read the end. Just as bees in roof beehives feed drones, their partners in their foul deeds, every day, all day long, until the sun goes down, the bees hurry about building their white honeycombs, while the drones sit inside the roofed beehives, feeding their stomachs on the toil of others. So did high thundering Zeus create women to be the bane of mortal men, partners in painful deeds. Okay, in other words, women are going to be like, making men work for them their entire lives. And he exchanged another good for evil. He who flees marriage and women's foul deeds and refused to marry comes to old age deprived of a caretaker. When he lives, he lacks nothing, but when he dies, his relatives divide his fortune. The man who marries a worthy wife, one whose mind is similar to his own, will see good and evil in balance throughout his life. Okay, so hold on. So on top of this, if you try to avoid women, what's going to happen to you? You're going to have no caretakers in the end of your life, right? So that's pretty nasty. But here we have a different kind of tonal shift. The man who marries a worthy wife, one whose mind is similar to his own, will see good and evil in balance throughout his life. But the man who takes a troublemaker for a wife will know endless incurable pain in his mind and heart during his life. Thus, no one can deceive the mind of Zeus. Not even Aepis's son, gracious Prometheus, could escape a foul fate. For despite his sharp mind, a terrible burden holds him down. Okay, so I cut the text off there because most of us know the punishment, the real punishment of Prometheus is that he is, bound to a rock, or a boulder or a mountain, whatever, and Zeus's eagle essentially goes and rips out his liver every day, and then it grows back, and then the eagle comes back and kind of just does this, on repeat forever. Okay, so what's going on here? A couple different things. So we have this initial kind of motif repeated again that we probably remember from Genesis of people who try to disobey or try to trick the divine, try to trick God, try to trick a power that is above themselves, right? That's Prometheus. That's what Prometheus is doing. So again, a lot of stories will tend to depict Prometheus as friendly to humankind, which is accurate to some degree, but he is a very flawed character as well because of that arrogance, because of that cleverness that he has about him, right? He thinks that he is better essentially, or that he can craft, deceptions around the gods, which you can't, you just can't do that. So that's a feature right there, this characterization of this being as clever, but also very arrogant and thinking he can deceive gods. Now, the element of fire, right? Giving human beings fire is an interesting one. It's it's like passed over generally here, but it's not worth passing over because it's really interesting in the sense that it's talking about human beings getting innovations and getting the access to materials, to knowledge, to power, whatever you want to call it, that will eventually, as we're going to see, do what? We don't know. Hesiod does not overtly tell us that Zeus is keeping fire from the human beings because he doesn't want them to challenge the gods. That's the best implication, though. That's the best sort of kind of reading that most people come up with. I think, you know, if we want to be really generous, we could say it's ambiguous. We don't know why Zeus is not giving human beings fire. Is it out of parental affection? We don't know. But Prometheus seems to think it'd be better if we have it, right? Give them more materials, give them more means to their ends, whatever those ends might be, and that's a good thing, right? So I think you could see it as very clearly a metaphor for technological advancement, for intellectual advancement, for power, therefore, all this kind of stuff. Okay, sure. And Prometheus is punished, but so are human beings. The punishment on human beings is the creation of women, right? So the creation of beings, what? That we now have to live in communion with, and that will quote unquote kind of, you know, seep away our our work. So in some sense, you know, this is interesting because you have this image of humanity where it's only men, right? Where it's only men and they're going to be just kind of crafting and creating things, you know, and advancing themselves in power their entire lives. But Zeus gives them women, which apparently is going to siphon off a lot of that energy into taking care of women, which the narrator at least clearly sees as something negative. However, you know, we get this one little part here where, you know, if we were a worthy wife, so it's not like, you know, he's seen as completely sexist here. I think there's also an element of goodness in women that is being, you know, put here, that if you marry a good wife, then you're going to have someone who is, yeah, similar to you, and you will see good and evil and balance throughout your life. You'll have a good life. So that's interesting. The only clear mention of goodness is in a picture of human beings together, both male and female, and not necessarily associated with fire. So keep this in mind. The narrator at least seems to be pushing the idea that this mutual kind of camaraderie, this balance of male and female, is a more positive thing. Now, some people read this as, oh, is Hesiod saying, you know, men are very like engineer, kind of, you know, very focused on like things psychologically and innovations and unworldly things, whereas women, you know, can be a little bit selfish, but can also kind of like draw them away from those interests a little bit towards perhaps something better. Or the narrator obviously implies something worse, right? So, or something that's at least less fulfilling, maybe. I don't know. Some people, if you want to be like a really, you know, classic feminist, you could read this as obviously quite negative, right? It's painting females as like a punishment for men in some way. However, you know, some feminists will look at this passage that I'm highlighting here and think, you know, some other really classical feminists and say, well, no, it's showing that females temper human ambition for the better. You know, they essentially help men control their ambition and focus on things like relationships, which perhaps might be better. So there's a little bit of tension here with what's going on with all this kind of stuff with male and female and what are the gods doing here. But essentially, guys, what we see is a tension between our relationship and the divine again, right? We want this fire, or at least Prometheus wants us to have this fire, and others, the gods, do not want us to have this. And yet we do get it. And then, you know, as a result, we have more and more struggles, essentially. We have more and more struggles introduced into our world. Okay, so tension with the divine, tension with reality here again. So with that, we're going to jump over to Daedalus and Icarus from Ovid's Metamorphosis. Now, the Metamorphosis is actually a Roman poem. So if you go read the Metamorphosis, you'll find it more in the sections of Roman literature. And the reason I include it here is because it's theoretically just Ovid's, you know, collection and oh my God, I can't speak. Synthesization. I can't speak this at all. Of Greek myths, essentially, that were somewhat connected, but he wanted to connect them all, essentially. He was doing one of those, you know, projects of synthesizing, there we go, of synthesizing all of the Greek myths in some way, shape, or form. So he includes Daedalus and Icarus. Now, let's take a look at these characters. Daedalus spoke and then set his mind to thinking of inventions as yet unknown, and thus he changed the course of nature. For he arranged rows of feathers, taking the smallest first, then the longer ones laid out in sequence. So it looked as if they'd grown out on a slope. like those ancient shepherds used to play with different reeds, which lengthened gradually. Okay, so Daedalus we're picking up in the middle of his story here. He's trying to invent something. He's trying to set his mind to inventions, as it says, as yet unknown, and thus he's changing the course of nature. He's changing the way of the natural world in some way, shape, or form. Okay, and what's he doing? He's building something with feathers. As we're going to see, he's very clearly building wings. All right. So those in the centers he had joined with threads. Those are the ends with wax. Once the feathers were assembled in this way, he shaped them into great curve, and so they looked like wings of real birds. His son Icarus stood beside him, unaware that the things he touched would put his life in danger. Sometimes he laughed as he caught the feathers shifting around in the wandering breeze, or with a thumb softened the yellow wax with his playful games. He kept interrupting his father's miraculous constructions. When Daedalus had put the final touches on what he had begun, he raised himself into the moving air, balancing his body between a pair of wings. He also gave the following instructions to his son. I warn you, Icarus, limit your flight to the region between heaven and earth. If you go too low, then water vapor will weigh down your wings. If you go too high, fire will burn them. So fly between the two. And listen, do not look at Botes, Helis, of the drawn sword of Orion. I will guide you. Okay, so follow the constellations, right? Don't follow the constellations, follow me instead. I will guide you. Follow the path I take. While Daedalus was telling him the rules of flying, he adjusted the new wings on Icarus's shoulders. While he worked and issued his advice, the old man's cheeks were wet, and the father's hands were trembling. Okay. So Daedalus creates wings of wax, right, and feathers, and he is instructing his son, Icarus, how to fly. Now, classic piece of little education he gives him is don't go too high, don't go too low. Go too high, they're gonna melt. Go too low, you're gonna get wet and you're gonna fall. Okay, follow me. Okay, now if we look real quick again, it says what? The fire will burn them, so fly between the two. Okay, keep this in mind. Fly between the two. Fly in the middle between heaven and earth. So we read on. He kissed his son. He would not kiss him again. Moved upwards on his wings and flew ahead. Concerned for his companion, just as a bird leads her tender chicks out of their high nest into the air, Daedalus keeps encouraging his son to follow as he demonstrates his skill in the dangerous art of flight. While moving his own wings, he glances back at the wings of Icarus behind him. Those who catch sight of them, a man angling for fish with a trembling rod, a shepherd leaning on his staff, or a farmer resting on his plow, are astonished and assume that people who can travel through the sky must be divine. Okay, so they're flying. Onlookers think, of course, like we said, that they must be divine. By now, the island Samos, sacred to the goddess Juno, that is Hera, was on their left, while Delos and Paros lay behind them, with Lebynthus on their right, along with Calimene, rich in honey, or Calimne, rich in honey. At this point, Icarus started to enjoy the flight, for all its perils, so he left his guide, and, filled with a desire to reach heaven, pursued a higher path. His close approach to the fierce sun softened the fragrant wax which held his wings in place. The wax melted. He flapped his naked arms, but since he had no oar-like wings, he failed to catch the air. While his mouth was screaming his father's name, his cries were drowned out by the sky blue sea, which takes its name from him. His sad father, now no more a father, shouted, Icarus, where are you, Icarus? Where should I look to find out where you are? He kept on calling, Icarus. Then he noticed feathers in the waves and cursed his own inventive skills. Okay. So, classic story. Icarus begins the flight, follows his father's instructions, enjoys the flight too much, and desires to go higher and reach heaven, as it says, right? Reach up into heaven. And like his father told him was going to happen, wings melt, he falls, he dies. And Daedalus is left alone, cursing his own inventive skills. Okay. So, looking at these two myths, what are two clear themes that they are communicating? I think one really clear one, through the symbols of fire or through the symbols of Prometheus's cleverness and also Daedalus's cleverness and his inventions, is this. There is serious danger in what? In defying the gods slash natural order. That's one way to look at it. Let's kind of, again, word that out a little bit differently. There's danger, yes, in defying the gods, right? But you might say, well, there's no gods that are dictating anything in the story of Icarus. Well, sure. That's why you might want to amend it to what? To defying nature, to defying the way the world is set up, whatever that might be. Whether that's, with the fact that human beings are not meant to fly, at least too high, and the idea that human beings should not, go against the dictates of Zeus and get fire when they're not supposed to. Sure. Okay. There's also, I think, a very clear theme here about the danger of intellectual innovation, right? That human beings, whether it's characters like Prometheus or Daedalus or Icarus, have a very serious danger in their intellectual cleverness, in their innovations of technology, of basically letting their inventions run away with them, right? And that, I think, is maybe the best theme that you could extract from both of these. The danger, the arrogance that comes with cleverness and inventions, right? That's, I think, one of the best ones that we could come up with here. Now, as to where in literature and film and other places we see this, well, I mean, we see this all over the place. The danger of cleverness, I mean, like, let's look right at the beginning of, biblical literature that we just looked at. The serpent is described as the cleverest, the most cunning of all the creatures. Again, like, we are skeptical of this, or we are weary of that, right? Of just kind of pure cleverness, right? It's not necessarily a good thing to be just clever, because you could, try to deceive the gods. You could try to, practice self-deception. You could try to kind of weasel your way out of things, right? It's an ambiguous sort of feature. And then we see the same thing like we saw in Cain. I mean, talking about biblical stories, it's really, really clear. I mean, we see the same feature in a figure like Nimrod, who is trying to build the Tower of Babel, right? The Tower of Babel. Literally like a parallel to both stories, essentially, that we see in the Bible, which is like human beings trying to build a tower reaching up to heaven. They're trying to increase their might or their being to such a degree that it's divine, essentially. Now, we see that also, by the way, in Milton's Paradise Lost. Lucifer is Satan, obviously, as he becomes Satan, really emphasizes his own intellect. He thinks that his intellect is the same as God's, and we see him, practicing kind of, powers of innovation, powers of cleverness, powers of intellect. He's very clearly worshiping his own mind, as I think these characters are here too. I think Prometheus, in some sense, worships his own cleverness. I think Icarus and Daedalus worship their own cleverness in some way, shape, or form. Do we see this outside of, stories like that? I mean, yeah, you see this usually associated quite a bit with villainous characters, hence like the evil mastermind, archetype. Obviously, I said we saw that in a story like the one that Christopher Nolan just told in film form, of a character like Oppenheimer, who is the first one to create an atomic bomb, essentially, right? A bomb that would eventually become so widespread and so well developed that if everybody used them, it would basically annihilate the human race. Okay. Now, that's why, I mean, you can kind of see why he is associated in the book that movie is based on, and the movie itself, with Prometheus, right? Very clear there, I think. So there's a danger in inventive skills. Okay. Now, One way that I think we could also look at this is what is it that these one theme we could also kind of look back on this and kind of articulate is what is it that these characters are trying to do? They're trying to dominate reality. They're trying to be the masters of reality around them, whether it's Prometheus in defying Zeus and taking fire and doing with it what he wants, whether it's human beings and just kind of getting that fire. I mean, human beings are kind of like, passive figures in that. They haven't really tried to do much with the fire. But I mean, Daedalus is a really clear example, right? Where he tries to actively defy nature in some way, shape, or way. In some way, shape, or form. Do we see this today in some sense? Do we see human beings acting in a way that tries to negate reality or defy reality? Well, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people who are really passionate about like climate change are going to step up and say absolutely. Whereas a lot of people who are very religious might say the same thing about what do you want to call it, like the different drugs and cosmetics that we seem to be obsessed with elongating human life at any cost, right? Sure, there's versions of that that are negative, I think you could say. Whereas, we can also say that characters like whatever futuristic dystopian story you want to talk about, figures like Elon Musk and other guys that want to really kind of lean into this transhumanism, right, where we can essentially either clone human beings or upload our minds into a digital format, or I should say copy our minds into a digital format, create AI, all this kind of stuff. So there's this idea that there's a danger in us trying to use our intellectual abilities and therefore our power to try to control reality. And these myths are essentially warning us that even from a very, very early point, guys, that is impossible. We can never become the masters of nature. It never will happen. There will always be some greater power than us. That we will never reach omnipotence over nature, right? And that's essentially, I think, what these stories are fundamentally kind of like communicating to us, is there's a serious danger in doing that, okay? You don't want to do that. You want to be, as the Greeks love to remind us, you want to be humble before the gods and before reality. Understand that we are limited beings who are just here and need to understand our place in the world. Okay, so that is, like I said, a really brief look at mythology. Now, you can answer those two questions. You can come up with totally different answers than I did, by the way, as long as they're, you think they're consistent with the themes or with the ideas that the text is laying forward. So come up with different ones if you want. That's fine. Now, for your assessment for these first two little sections, like I said, throughout the year, I think I mentioned this in one of the early videos. Throughout the year, we are going to have journals, and the journal assignments, really, really straightforward. You're going to read the prompt, you're going to read the directions, which are always going to be the same, and pick one of the following prompts, answer it 2 to 3 paragraphs. Doesn't need to be in essay format. It can just be in a direct answer format. So I don't need anything really, really complicated or ultra formal here. You can use first person. I'm okay with that. This is a very informal version of writing, right? Formal writing we're going to get to with essays and all this kind of stuff. But what I do want you to do is, yes, give me at least 3 direct quotations from any of the texts that we read. So anything from the religious texts, anything from these mythic texts, fill those in. That's fine. Also, give us one lens of interpretation, right? So remember back to all of our lenses that we could use. Just throw in a mention of one way that, one of these lenses could interpret some element of these stories or some element of what you're trying to give me in your answer. So really quickly, let me just show you what the options are, and then we'll call it a day. Number 1, you could write about this. Explain what some of the central purposes and goals are in religious literature and mythic literature, and how they employ at least 3 writing techniques to achieve this purpose, right? So what is it that is the purpose here of these texts, both religious and mythic, and what techniques, what literary elements are they using to do this? So for example, I mean, they're very clearly using symbolism, they're using metaphor, they're using a theme, right? They're using motifs, they're using kind of like a repetition of these motifs again and again and again. Talk about this, right? Talk about what we see there. Number 2, explain why you suspect that humans find both religious literature and mythic literature so compelling and captivating, and why some do or do not in our contemporary culture. Okay, in other words, why are these things so popular, but why do some people not like them? Okay, explain this to me. Number three, explain where you have seen religious literature or mythic literature inspire and influence literature or other forms of art that you and your peers may be more familiar with. Okay, so talk to me about movies, talk to me about books you may have read, talk to me about video games if you want, talk to me about songs that you're listening to that you like, talking about TV shows, whatever. Talk to me about where you might see these things influencing what we are looking at and maybe what you are absorbing every day in artwork. Okay, so do that. Make sure that you include at least, like we said, 3 direct quotations. Make sure you do give us at least one lens of interpretation in your discussion. And then that's all we need for the journal. Okay, thanks so much for that. Next time we will begin another very brief look at some nonfiction texts and the historical context around them before we move into short stories. So thanks very much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.